Search for justice.
Black Lives Matter! We don't need this to be a one-day occasion.
Begins with you.
One person can create something like this and bring people together.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want it?
The conversation starts now. ABC 12 presents The Path Forward.
Good evening and welcome to The Path Forward. I'm Matt Franklin.
And I'm Dawn Jones. Thank you for joining us tonight as we have a conversation about race, inequity, and how we can educate ourselves and work together to create change in our communities.
You know, for the past month, the nation has been in a state of unrest. The issues leading to those moments, well, they have been building for centuries.
ABC 12 is committed to tackling these issues head on and in depth, taking a look at how we got here and how we travel the path forward.
As the cries of our nation grew louder following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police 1 month ago in Minneapolis,
millions took to the streets of their own communities.
In order to get peace, we must do something different.
Calling for change, justice, and action.
no one knew what would come from these demonstrations. Some turned violent, pitting police against protesters.
But in our communities,
George Floyd! George Floyd!
those divisions were dissolved with a simple fist bump.
We saw law enforcement march arm in arm with protesters in solidarity.
We got this! We got this!
Committed to change all across mid-Michigan.
But as the marches stop, where do we go from here? Well, one of the first things we have to address is our need to talk to each other. Conversations about race, excessive force by police, and systemic racism, well, they are uncomfortable to have, but needed in order to have breakthroughs. While we may not always get it right, we may not say the right thing, but at least trying, it's the start of understanding. And let's begin tonight with Pastor Christopher Pryor of Victorious Believers Ministries in Buena Vista Township. Pastor Pryor, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, what a joy to be on with you. I want to commend this TV station for continuing the message and discussion. So thank you.
Well, let's dive right into that. The first question, let's get at the root of this. Why are people so uncomfortable when it comes to talking about race?
You know, I think it's been rooted for years. So many people, you know, when it comes to moving forward, don't realize. And so it's time to be educated. And I think the George Floyd, along with some of the other issues that have just happened over the last several months, has reached its boiling point.
Today, we're focusing in on the cause for justice for Breonna Taylor.
According to Kentucky law, the use of force by Mattingly and Cosgrove was justified to protect themselves.
Just yesterday afternoon, the state of Kentucky announced that there will not be any charges against the officers involved in Breonna Taylor's shooting death at the hands of police. Instead, 3 charges against one officer for firing into the walls of the apartment. Those shots went into another apartment. More than 6 months ago, police raided Taylor's home in a no-knock warrant. They were at the wrong house. The indictments handed down by the grand jury ignited protests from across the nation last night, including right here in Flint.
There seems to be 2 justice systems in America, one for white America and one for black America.
And in Louisville, 2 officers were shot amid the protests there. A suspect has been arrested and is in custody. The indictment has caused outrage and frustration among many. For the city of Louisville, they had already settled a wrongful death lawsuit with Breonna Taylor's family for $12 million. So why no charges in her death? Joining us now is Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton. And Prosecutor, always a pleasure to have you on ABC 12.
Hi, Don. Good to be with you this afternoon.
Now, as you can imagine, emotions are very high over what has transpired in Kentucky with the Breonna Taylor case, and it's a lot to peel back here, but let's get started. For many folks, they just want to know, how is it possible that a woman is shot in her home at the hands of police and no one is held accountable?
And welcome back to the Path Forward. He was one of the first law enforcement officials to march with protesters upset following the death of George Floyd. This afternoon, we sit down with Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson to talk about the changes he's making in his department and what he's learned since the start of this movement. Chris, we talk about change. We talk about change so much. What is it that your department can do to help facilitate that change here in Genesee County as we work through the racial injustices and try to fix the systemic issues happening?
Well, change comes individually. I mean, I could put out all the protocols and guidelines, but if I don't set the example of what's expected individually, not even just as a sheriff, but as a human being, then it's hard to create a culture where people even want to change.
The American Civil Liberties Union is challenging the school-to-prison pipeline. The data compiled by that organization reveals how black students are adversely affected by the policies. They represent 31% of school-related arrests. They are suspended and expelled 3 times more than their white counterparts. And those students who are suspended or expelled for discretionary violations are nearly 3 times as more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. Joining us for our discussion today is Dawn Demps, PhD candidate at Arizona State University. She's also working on her dissertation around this topic. And Dawn, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dawn. Thank you very much.
So why don't we just start at the beginning? Explain to us how the school-to-prison pipeline works and why that policy is so dangerous.
Well, the school-to-prison pipeline really is the combination of the policies and practices that effectively push students from outside of classrooms and onto this path to prison or the judicial system.
Today, we're looking at an organization that is relatively new, but you're hearing a lot about. Black Lives Matter. Earlier this month, the mayor of Washington, D.C. took a bold step painting Black Lives Matter on the street that leads to the White House. Other cities followed that lead, including in Flint. But just this week, President Trump said a proposed mural for Black Lives Matter in New York City outside of Trump Tower would be a symbol of hate. While some call Black Lives Matter a hate group, some call the organization community activism. Black Lives Matter first started as a hashtag after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida. The man who killed him was later acquitted of murder in 2013. That hashtag grew momentum, but didn't become an organization until after Michael Brown's death in 2014, followed by Eric Garner's death. In both cases, the officers involved in their deaths were either acquitted or never charged. In 2014, the hashtag became an organization, now with chapters all across the country, including in Flint. Today, we continue our conversation with the president and vice president of the Flint chapter of Black Lives Matter, DeJuan Robinson and Johnny Franklin III. What is Black Lives Matter? What does it really stand for?
Black Lives Matter is a collective group of people who have just been frustrated for a long time and understanding that black people have been devalued in the United States of America for so long. So we say 401 years. Our thing is just ensuring that we get some equality out of this.
George Floyd! And after the fist bump and the hug, I definitely noticed the change in the crowd, and they noticed the change in us.
As U.S. cities held Black Lives Matter protests, many were peaceful, but as you see right there, some turned violent with scenes of looting, rioting, and violence against police. It was a fist bump that brought worldwide attention to the Flint area, a show of solidarity between law enforcement and those fed up with racial injustice. There was conversation, hugs, and eventually both sides marching side by side, vowing to bring about change and understanding. Detective Chad Miller kicked off the show of unity that evening. He's with the Flint Township Police Department and also works with the Genesee County Sheriff's Department. Tonight, we dig deeper on his thoughts on that moment and the role law enforcement plays in helping to ease tensions.
We let them walk up and down Miller Road, and then they ended up making their way to the police department.
And they made that turn to the police department, and you guys were all standing there lined up. What were you thinking? Because you have hundreds of people coming at you. Let's continue the conversation about minority voting power, especially in this election. After watching the conventions, there seemed to have been an emphasis placed on race from both parties. How important is the minority vote for anyone running in the November election?
Well, the thing is with minority voting, I'm always skeptical of media telling us about how many blacks that didn't vote. as opposed to how many blacks do vote.
Now to the COVID-19 pandemic, it has pulled back a curtain, would you say, on healthcare disparities in the black community. Blacks are twice as likely to die after contracting the virus than white Americans, and research also shows that blacks have better outcomes when treated by black doctors. So tell us how this $100 million grant to the nation's 4 historically black medical schools will help close some of these disparities, and also, as stated in your news release, save black lives.
Absolutely. We had to start there because you can't start talking about wealth without extending the lives of Black people. You know, we need time to earn more, to keep more, to be able to set up the infrastructure to pass it down.
This executive order followed by another that declares racism a public health crisis, directing state health officials to plan policies to address systemic racism in our state. And one of the people leading this charge is Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the executive order that the governor issued yesterday, creating the Black Leadership Advisory Council. It's the first of its kind. What exactly will be the role of this council in our state?
Well, this is important because Black Michiganders are the largest racial or ethnic minority in our state, and we have a responsibility in state government to be responsive to our communities.
Civil unrest, racial disparities surrounding COVID-19, and the deaths of Black Americans like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery have opened the door to many heavy discussions in homes all across our country. But what does that conversation look like when your family is transracial? What are some of the revelations that come to light? Joining us to take a closer look at this topic today is Harmony Lloyd, a Grand Blanc mother of 2 biracial sons and 1 white son. And Harmony, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt.
You know, it's been a lot over the past several months. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, but I think the question isn't how I'm doing. It's how you're doing and how all of my Black friends and brown friends are doing. I think that's what we need to be focusing on right now.
Today, we shine a light on mass incarcerations. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world. More than 2.2 million adults are being held in America's prisons and jails. The higher rates of incarceration are often seen among racial minorities. And studies show when released from prison, 2 out of 3 people are rearrested and more than half are put back behind bars. That's according to the Bureau of Justice. Today, we talked to 3 African-American men who committed crimes in their youth. They served their time and are now working in the community to help stem the flow of incarceration for African-Americans and reduce the rate of recidivism for those who have been released. Joining us now is Leon El-Alamin. He's the founder of the MADE Institute. After being sentenced to several years behind bars for drug trafficking as a teen, he vowed to come home to Flint and make a difference. Thank you so much for joining us today, Leon.
Thank you for having me.
So you are a Flint native, so why don't we just start with your upbringing? Tell me about what area of town you were brought up in and what that experience was like.
Yeah, absolutely. So born and raised in the city of Flint. I grew up on Flint's north side. Most of my adolescent years with my grandmother, and as I became a teen, later on mostly with my mother. The area in which we grew up was really crime and drug ridden and violence prone.
Welcome back to the Path Forward as we continue our conversation around the work being done to bring awareness to racial injustice and ways to eradicate systemic racism. Bob Brown joins us today. He's the Associate Director of the Center for Community and Economic Development at Michigan State University, and he's also one of the founders of Neighborhoods Without Borders, a network of Flint people working to dismantle systemic and institutional racism. Welcome to the program, Bob.
Well, thank you very much.
So you are a Flint resident, and Flint is a city that's roughly 53% African American. So how would you describe race relations in the city of Flint?
Now, that's always such a multifaceted question.
The recent civil unrest, racial disparity surrounding COVID-19, And the deaths of Black Americans have opened the door to many heavy discussions in homes all across our country. But that conversation takes on a bit of a different tone when you are in an interracial relationship. And joining us to take a closer look at this topic today are Jonathan and Shannon Polk from Grand Blanc. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
If you could, let's kick the conversation off with just the basics. How did you two meet, and how long ago, and when did you guys get married?
Back to the path forward. This week we are looking at the importance of having representation in the medical field and how not having that representation is an example of systemic inequities in our society. And joining us for this segment is Dr. Larry Young, graduate of Howard University School of Medicine. And Dr. Young also been delivering babies here in the Flint area for more than 30 years. It is our pleasure, sir, to have you on the path forward today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's first talk about what the Bloomberg Philanthropies has done, giving $100 million to the 4 Black HBCU medical schools, including your alma mater, Howard University. How significant is this?